Well, thanks for allowing me to have a chat with you again. Some of the stuff I'm going to say we actually covered a little bit of it in the past, but this kind of brings things together in a different way. When we're now in the third year of COVID, okay, which has caused something like 300 million people been infected with it, over 5 million have been dead, and that's a very, very conservative estimate. We really have no idea of the deaths. So it's quite a good time to look back at some of the pandemics we've had and look ahead at what these pandemics can have in store for us as a species, if you like. The thesis I'm going to try and develop is that pandemics occur during particular moments in history. And what they do is they not only deepen those fissures, those currents that are there, but sometimes are able to direct them in different directions. So pandemics do have major roles in history. And what I'm going to do is use 5 examples of pandemics throughout history, coming up to our own, just trying to illustrate the various aspects of what I'm trying to say, and to show that pandemics affect political, social, and economic consequences that are in the life of humanity, really. Okay. Before we say anything, just want to say a few words about the role of microorganisms, because we tend to, because we don't see these damn things, okay, because they're submicroscopic. We don't, when we talk about nature, we tend to ignore what is in fact the largest biomass in numbers and the largest in biodiversity in terms of different forms of all the other creatures put together. The 2 microorganisms I'm going to talk about are just the viruses and bacteria, really, the examples I'm going to give. I'm not going to talk about the other forms like archaeons and even things like prions, which I'm sure will have its own talk if necessary. Let's just take viruses first. I mean, we all know that viruses they can't reproduce themselves. They actually need a host to reproduce itself, okay? So if you just imagine that if every single creature on Earth just had one unique virus, the diversity of viruses we have in this world is more than all the other creatures put together. And if you want to get an idea of the numbers, somebody actually sat in a coffee shop and you know, on the back of an envelope and worked out that if you put all the viruses in the world end to end, you will have a chain that a ray of light will take 200 years to go from one end to another. In other words, that chain will go way beyond our galaxy and our Milky Way. So effectively, we're talking about a huge mass of diverse organisms, which of course most of them will have nothing to do with human beings. I mean, they're either don't affect us but it just gives you an idea of the diversity. Similarly with bacteria, all the bacteria don't need a host to reproduce themselves. They are very, very numerous. Just to give a feel of that, each one of us who's sitting here talking and listening to this talk, each one of us will have more microbes in our body than all the cells of our body put together. And you can just go on and on looking at numbers, just to give you a feel of how diverse they are, how numerous they are, and that we should consider them as part of the biomass that exists around us, okay? Let's just think a little bit about infection, okay? If a microbe goes from an animal to a human, okay, that's a biological process. A microbe's going from a microbe to human. If it then goes from a human to a human and they can be passed along, in other words, it can survive within that human, be able to be passed on to another human and be passed on to another one, you create an epidemic, and if regions then start infecting other regions, you get a pandemic. The first action, going from animal to human, is a biological action. But the transference of this microbe, this virus, from a human to another human is actually a social process, if you think about it. In other words, pandemics are a reflection at any moment in time of the social relations in any given moment in time in a particular junction of history. Okay, and put it differently, pandemics are human creations. Okay, pandemic in effectively humans. It is us humans that create pandemics, and of course they in turn affect our relations. And that's the basis of talk I'm going to give. And I'm going to use 5 pandemics. Okay, 2 of them are with the bacteria, which is the plague virus, the plague bacterium, which occurred at the beginning and at the end of the Middle Ages. Then we're going to go fast forward into the First World War and the huge influenza epidemic of the end of the First World War. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about the HIV pandemic, which occurred in the 80s during the new liberal globalization. And then we'll come to our today's COVID-19 pandemic. So let's just look at the plague first. Plague is caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium which lives in the flea that inhabits rats and mice. Okay. And it can be passed on to humans, it can be passed on to cats, it can be passed on to dogs, some domestic animals like that, okay? So a conjunction between rats, mice, and humans is where this transmission occurs. And it can cause a pretty lethal disease with a mortality rate way into the, over 70–80% mortality rate, particularly the pneumonic type of thing. So I want us just to start with the year 541, okay? In the Eastern Roman Empire, Justinian is the Eastern Roman emperor. He's a warrior emperor. He likes to unite the Eastern and Western Roman Empire together. So he initiates a series of wars in Europe. He's a conquering emperor. He initiates a series of wars in North Africa, in Ethiopia. He begins to fight the Sasanian Iranian kings, Sasanian kings in the Asia Minor. He sends armies into the Caucasus. In other words, there is movements over his entire reign. There are movements of armies across Europe, across North Africa, across the beginning of the Middle East. Okay, in Iran, the Sasanian king Anushiravan, Khosrow Anushiravan, has become the king. He has inherited a country that was in turmoil. It was in revolt and in turmoil, and he brutally puts it down by massacring the rebellion of a new religious sect called the Mazdaks, who were very much an egalitarian kind of sect, had almost like communistic-like concepts. And by massacring over 200,000 of those, he initiates his reign. He's also a conquering emperor. He fights Justinian, and in Asia Minor, they both fight together again in the Caucasus. He moves troops down into the Arabian Peninsula, and he moves into Central Asia. So in other words, we have movement of armies, huge movement of armies over a period of time. And it is this movement of armies which carries the plague from one place to another. Now, we don't quite know when it initiated. It might have initiated in North Africa. It might have initiated in the Kyrgyzstan, where today's Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. It's immaterial. The fact is that it actually caused a huge devastation. We know roughly about 100 million people died during this pandemic. And 100 million, when you think about it, the population of that part of West Asia and Europe is a huge proportion of that population. Just to give you an example, 1/3 of Constantinople, of the inhabitants of Constantinople died. In Europe, between 20 and 60% of the population died. So huge devastation, which caused 8 years of famine. It was followed by 8 years of famine. Agriculture was totally destroyed, and it was the beginning of the rotational crop system, crop rotations, where we had wheat, and then the year next on the same piece of land, the next year you put another crop, and then you had the year that was fallow, which improved the productivity of land. Okay, and in the West, in Western Europe, the Western Roman Empire never really recovered after this pandemic, and we had this new kingdoms developing. Feudalism developed during this time. The The peasant was then now stuck to the land, so serfdom began in Western Europe. And effectively, we had the beginning of countries, we had the beginning of serfdom, we got feudalism. The Middle Ages have begun. In Iran, something quite the opposite happened, if you like. The famine and the plague caused the destruction of the large landowners. Okay, what this did was created a new class of smaller landowners, which actually were really sort of small, low-level aristocracy, who sort of, if you like, low-ranking aristocracy, which created a new class. And so he was added to the three already recognized classes in the Sasanian society, which were the aristocracy, the clergy, the commoners, and now we had this new class, dehqan, which I could translate as farmers. Okay, well, they were effectively small landlords. What this did was strengthen the centralized government. And in the wars of Anushiravan with this more powerful centralized government allowed the creation of the Silk Route. So the large Silk Route, Silk Trail, which linked trade from China across the Middle East into Europe. This was the beginning of that time. And when about 100 years later, that route was disrupted because of bandits and breakdown in civil society, it allowed the newly arisen Arab merchants, which rose under the banner of Islam, to spread the same routes, the same trade across North and take over the east-west trade across the Mediterranean, across North Africa, across into Europe. Okay, so that was the consequence, if you like, of the first pandemic of the plague. The same bacterium, if we now move forward about 8 centuries into 1346. Now, let's now concentrate now mostly in Europe, because the most data we have of the Great Black Death is actually from Europe. We have city-states like Venice, like Genoa, like sort of port states, okay, which we actually had control of the trade in the Mediterranean. And we believe that it was through this trade from Mediterranean that the rats were carried from North Africa, probably, in ships into the ports, and then from the ports it then spread across the entire continent. It went as far north as Denmark, as far west as England, and then went to the Middle East as well. And we have some data about the Mediterranean, at least part of the Middle East, which was also devastated. Whatever from the data we have, it looks as if it was hugely devastating. It caused something 1/3 to 1/4 of Europe's population died. The population actually, about 1/10 of all the farms in Europe, all the villages in Europe, all the farms in Europe disappeared forever. Were never reconstituted again. The population in 1346 fell to below what it was in 1290. In other words, for half a century earlier. And it took at least a century and a half again until the 16th century before the population came back to where it was before. So major devastation. And what it caused was the price of land fell. So merchants who had more capital were able then to invest in land and became the new landlords. Feudals were weakened. The peasants were therefore liberated, and in Western Europe, serfdom ceased and never came back again in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, they were able to reinstitute it again later on, but in Western Europe, serfdom never came back. The freely mobile labor came into the cities, and of course, the price of labor went up. And when the price of labor went up, so that stimulated innovation in technology and in production. Merchant capital, which now become the only capital that was not really damaged that much, was able to invest in not only just in land, but also in industry, and became part of the new industrial capital. One beautiful example of that is the Welser family in South Germany, who were originally flax merchants, and then they started producing flax themselves in the farms. They actually planted and produced flax, and also were selling it. So they became a hugely massively rich sort of industrial agricultural combined, and the Wesley family later on moved to Venezuela and actually owned Venezuela for a long period of time. They became the virtual owners of Venezuela. And there are many more examples of this. So because of all the developments we talked about, the banking, the system of banking was strengthened. Just remember the Medici family, who became wildly rich in banking, to accommodate this mobility in capital across Europe. And the net result was this: because the price of labor had gone up, you had to suppress that price of labor, and it was actually suppressed within the next 2 or 3 decades after that. The central state became stronger. It was able to collect more taxation, and effectively we see what was already happening across Europe, which was the beginning of capitalism. It accentuated and sped up the development of capitalism, the Black Death. We can discuss it later if people who know more about these things than I do can actually come in and help out on this one. Let's move now to viruses, okay? And we're now moving a few more centuries forwards, and we're now at the end of the First World War, okay? The virus is the H1N1 influenza virus, and its genes have come originally partly from swine, partly from bird, okay? And this is a particular characteristic of influenza, where you can actually exchange just bunches of genes from between one species and another, and you create a new species, which is, if you like, a mosaic, a chimera of 2 or sometimes more different viruses. Okay, this is a characteristic of influenza as well as other viruses. So this kind of reconstitution gives it quite a great flexibility in developing and changing. So the H1N1 at the beginning of the First World War developed mutations that made it much more infectious. Okay, made it not only much more infectious, it was actually became more lethal. So when a normal seasonal flu that we see every year kills around 0.001% of people it affects, if you look at the whole population as a whole, 0.001. Here the mortality rate was between 1 and 3%. It doesn't sound very high, 1 to 3%. But when you talk about millions of people being affected, the actual numbers go up. So what was the background then? So the background here was World War I, troop movements, not just across Europe, but from the colonies, from France, from Africa, from India, from other parts of Asia and other parts of the world to here. So there was huge movement of troops. We have troop movement. We had hunger. Do you remember the war? Not only just the hunger caused by the war itself, but the actual blockade of European ports by the Allies against the Germans had produced mass hunger across the country, weakening the population and making them more susceptible to infection. And of course, there was social upheavals. We had the Russian Revolution of 1917 in the background. It is with this background that the US joined the war and brought with it the influenza virus. So we think the influenza virus actually came from US, probably they're being transferred to the troops via the pig farms in the United States. They came to Europe and it rapidly spread across Europe and across Asia and across Africa. We're talking about the death of 50 to 100 million people. Now that's much more than actually died during the war itself. The influenza epidemic actually had a bigger mortality than the war itself. This was particularly true in places outside Europe. India lost 5% of its population, 5% of its population. Iran lost between 8 and 20% of its population as an estimate, okay? But partly caused by the virus, but partly caused by the famines that were associated with the mortality of the virus. And these had major consequences after that. In Europe, just to give you an idea how it happened in Europe, about half to 1.5% of the population died. And in the US, of course, because being further away from the war, further away from the influenza epidemic, actually was much less than that. So effectively, the US was damaged much less than Europe. Already a country which already was, from the capitalist development point of view, was the largest capitalist economy in the world, now became even more so. After this pandemic and after the war, there was the GDP in the US dropped by 1.5%. In Europe, it dropped more than 6%. So that disparity between capitalism in Europe and capitalism in America was accentuated by the war and the subsequent slaughter caused by the pandemic. This caused in Europe major upheavals. We had strikes, we had revolutions, we had revolution in Germany, in Eastern Europe, and there was social upheaval in almost every single country in Europe, as you all know. Even Switzerland, which was neutral, peaceful, quiet, gentle, cuckoo land, Switzerland actually came near to civil war. But the difference in the mortality between Europe and Asia was also reflected in the impact it had particularly in Asia, where the anti-imperialist movements were very much stimulated after the war and accentuated to some extent by the pandemics. Just to give you an example, the Indian Congress until then had really demanded reforms within the colonial system. From then on, they demanded independence. In Java, we had major industrial strikes across the whole of Asia. In Java, we had sugar factories workers going on strike. British plantations in Assam went on strike. There was strikes everywhere. The anti-imperialist movements everywhere in Asia was accentuated. In Iran, the famine and which was followed the war and the pandemic, which, as I said, had killed between 8 and 20%, really weakened the relationship between peasant and the feudal farmers or water farmers, the landowners and peasants, and paved the way for Reza Shah to create the modern state the modern Iranian state that we have today. Okay, so that's all I was going to say about H1N1. I want to move now to the late 80s. Now, around the early parts of the 20th century, we think roughly around sometime in the early 20th century, a virus, retrovirus, which was in the chimpanzee, already itself was a combination virus from two other monkeys that the chimpanzee had actually eaten, moved from chimpanzee to man in Cameroon. Okay, it moved there probably through what's called bushmeat. Okay, was eaten, and during the process, the blood got mixed up and got in there. And we think that during those 40-50 years until the middle of the century, there would be families here, this one village there in Cameroon with this disease that would kill a family, would kill a village. After a few years, this mysterious disease, and it stayed there. After the 50s, this virus suddenly began to spread across Africa and then spread across the world. In a very short period of time, it became global. What is it that actually caused the virus that was localized to a corner of Cameroon to become a global pandemic? Let's look at how it spread around Africa. Around Africa, there were two elements that started to spread. It was the growth of mining, and this was a time when Africa they started exploiting African mines, and we now have mines right the way across from the east. You can start from on West Africa and going in an arc all the way down into Southern Africa, of mines, tin mines, gold mines, diamond mines, copper mines. I mean, the wealth of this virgin land started being exploited and plundered. And with it was improved transport. The first one was the Congo River became navigable. They opened up the Congo River navigable, which allowed the workers from the Cameroon to go down into the mines in the Congo. Okay, and from then on, the it was the roads that were built to move this stuff from mines into the ports that then carried them to Europe and to America and to other places. So effectively, the combination of mining and transport was the backdrop to this spread. But who got it? Well, remember, we did talk about this. Some of you may remember we talked about it some years ago. you had a mobile workforce. In Africa, the workforce became completely mobile. I mean, just to give you an example, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Ivory Coast, a quarter of all the workers were actually migrant workers. Similar to in South Africa and in other places. They were housed in single-sex dormitories, away from their families for days, weeks, and sometimes for months. Okay, and they were serviced by women, casual sex workers, commercial sex workers, by sex workers during that period of time. The women who were the families were left behind. The women had no work to do. This was a time when the IMF had actually, with its policy of privatization, had destroyed even the rudimentary social welfare services that existed in some of the African countries. And effectively, there was no other work to do for women who were the lowest rank of that social structure, except to sell their own bodies. Hence, we have even the help of the management in this. I mean, one example I've given you before, I think, is that in Ivory Coast there was this huge, large industrial farm actually, where every Saturday and Sunday, which was payday, the bosses would bus in busloads of sex workers for the weekend, and each sex worker would service between 20 to 25 clients. And so you can see how the whole setup was really created for a transmission of virus from one person to another. Lorry drivers were the other group of people. People who were taking the products of these mines through roads through, for example, through Uganda and Kenya into Mombasa. And if you follow the routes from those highways, the nearer you are to those highways, the village, the higher was the rate of HIV. In some villages, over 80, 90% of the women in those villages were actually infected with HIV. It was the sex workers giving services to these lorry drivers who then went home and went back. All of the workers and the lorry drivers went home to give it to their wives and their families. So that was the route of spread within Africa, and then across the world. Even in the Far East, it was the drug addiction, it was drugs, and now the mobilization of money allowed drug smugglers. I mean, the huge rise in transnational drug smuggling and and rise in drug addiction in the Far East, in Burma, in Thailand, in countries like that, and then later on, when the Soviet Union, when the Soviet bloc collapsed in the countries in Soviet bloc, where drug addiction and sharing of needles. Just remember, HIV is transmitted by sex, by sharing blood, and from mother to child transmission. So the only three ways it can actually transmit itself. And then, of course, the sex work in the Far East, and through sex tourism that was particularly marked in places like Thailand, but also in the other countries of the Far East. The cause of all this, as we already alluded to, is the neoliberal globalization, which mobilized, which freed the workforce to move. So highly mobile workforce, highly mobile money. Just to give you an example, the sort of circulating money in 1980, there was $2 trillion of circulating money in 1980. In year 2000, 20 years later, this was 20 trillion. In 2020, this had risen between 600 and 1,200 trillion dollars of, if you like, floating money, of which some of which was used in illegal drug and human smuggling across borders, which now accounts for a significant portion of global trade. According to UN, for instance, that 21 million people at the moment, and this moment in time, 21 million people have been driven, men, women, and children have been used have been trafficked and effectively are slaves, having been trafficked across the world. I've just given you a sort of brief glance of the sort of mechanism in which a virus which was very localized can become globalized through changes in economic policy and change in relationships between humans. Perhaps of the consequences of the HIV pandemic, I'd just like to allude to two. I'm just picking almost at random two that I would like just to talk about. One of them is I think is quite an interesting one. It's since the HIV, almost every single new drug that has been produced was actually produced in laboratories or universities or what have you that were funded by governments, in other words, funded socially. Once something came out of it, like for instance, hepatitis C drugs that came out, and now the vaccines that we're using today in COVID-19, once that original expenditure showed that you actually can produce something, they were then taken up by the drug companies and made into profit. So the expenditure, the risk was taken on public money, the profit has become privatized, okay? And this has become much more, you cannot think of a single major drug, not Me Too drugs, but a single major drug group over the last 20, 30 years that actually has not been along this pathway I'm talking about. Drugs, and particularly vaccines now, because vaccines, no drug company was interested in researching on vaccine because it's very expensive, and the yield financial yield was usually not very much. Now, with this way it's going, of course, Pfizer is making a fortune. We'll come to that when we talk about our final pandemic. The other thing I wanted to talk about is one thing that we noticed, we actually studied well during the HIV epidemic, which is the change in social behavior, which almost certainly had occurred in all the other pandemics as well. But now we've been looking at it and watching it. And it's a very interesting combination, which I want you to just, for 1 second, look at. We have a combination of solidarity with the victims and repulsion, distrust. And that combination is an interesting combination because the distrust actually then leads to a denial. And you can see that very much with our current pandemic, where effectively you have larger and larger sections of the population effectively denying the existence of this particular drug. Same thing happened with HIV. And of course, the other side of the coin of denial is risk-taking. We saw that in HIV, and we see that in COVID-19, which brings us really to our today's pandemic. And I want us to look at today's pandemics from the point of view of the microorganism, okay? What is this world that we've created that makes it so much easier for the microorganism to become, to move from person to person, region to region, and very rapidly become a pandemic? Just remember, it only took a couple of months for the virus to move from one point in space-time into the entire world, okay? Really the most amazingly rapid movement. What is it that did that? And you can answer that by the word mobility. We're in a world that everything is mobile. Humans are mobile, production's mobile, commodities are mobile, productions are broken down are mobile. The human beings have always been the most mobile of all mammals. And of course, technology and the way we organize ourselves these days has accentuated that almost to insane levels of mobility that we have. Just to remind ourselves, for instance, in 2019, 4.5 million people flew from one place to another. Okay, so that is just an ideal for a virus. Okay, sitting on the back of one of these mobile things. The other point, the other aspect that assists the movement of a virus from an animal source into a human source is is industrial agriculture. Okay. Now, let me just give you one concrete example. In 1967, there were 1 million pig farms in the United States. In 2003, there was 100,000. In other words, there was a 10-fold reduction. In other words, while of course the whole production of pigs had actually expanded. So you can see how the collection, the collective, the cramming together of these of the pigs makes it so. Just remember, the influenza virus was a swine bird. So in other words, genes from a bird influenza and genes from a swine influenza got together, and you can think of that of other viruses that are able to adapt themselves to that and adapt themselves to be transmitted to a human host. Okay. Just to give an idea of the volume of meat we're talking about globally 1.5 billion cattle, 1 billion pigs, 20 billion poultry across the world, half of which are produced in industrial farms. Okay, so here we have, if you like, a laboratory, a petri dish ready for the mixing of viruses from different species together. And of course, by cramming them together, you put them in easier touch, not just with each other, but with other wild animals like birds, like rodents, etc., etc. Okay, so that's one part of the story. We have an assault on nature. There's no part of nature anymore now which is virgin. We have gone into every single virgin forest that we have in Amazon. We've gone into all the virgin forests in Africa, in Indonesia, etc., etc. Okay, by going into those regions, you have liberated, you have brought in contact humans and whatever they have with them, with new viruses that had not seen humans. In other words, giving opportunities for new creations of new viruses that can, if they're lucky, most of them won't, but some will then adapt to human beings. And if they can go from one human being to another, that is an epidemic and a pandemic for you, okay? Then of course, wars. I mean, there's not been a single year since the Second World War where we have not had war somewhere in the world. And tourism, both tourism, but also more and more people are tourism in pilgrimage. Pilgrimages in India across into the Ganges, pilgrimages from across the world to Mecca, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Just to give an idea of the population movement that we're talking about, just give you a couple of figures, and I'm nearly going to finish on this one. Okay. In 2019, the UN estimated that in that 1 year alone, 33.4 million people were uprooted in 1 year alone, 2019. And in 2020, 280 million people live somewhere where they were not born, in another country which was not the country of birth. 280 million people. 10% currently, 10% of the world population actually are migrants. So here it is, the background where COVID can come in. So what advantage did COVID have? Okay. This is our third coronavirus pandemic. We already had two before, one 2003, one 2009. We had the SARS and we had the MERS pandemic, both of which did not spread for reasons that I will just explain to you in a minute, okay? This particular one, the third wave of corona, the reason it is so successful is that A, it's highly infectious. And we can actually give a figure to that because we have in epidemiology a figure called R0. R0 is the number of people one single infected person can infect. So R0 for COVID was 1.2 to 1.6. In other words, each person on average would infect 1.2 people, 1.6. You just have to multiply that in your head, and in time to see how rapidly that is. The Delta variant, which is now taken over the whole world, the 1 R value was 6. That's as infectious as measles, okay? And this new creature that's come along, Omicron, okay, then I'm running out of the Greek word letters that I knew about, okay? The Omicron is even more infectious than apparently even more infectious than the Delta. Okay, so it's a highly infectious virus that actually does not kill a huge number of people. That's another advantage it has. Okay, because if you kill a lot of people like Ebola does, then it's very easy to isolate it and to control it and to destroy it. Okay, by separating those infected people from the non-infected people. If you only kill a small number relatively, then all the others who are not killed, or even those, even better, if you don't have any symptoms, become a source of passing on without killing. So, I mean, that's why influenza is so efficient. It kills 0.001. Now, this virus kills about 0.1% of people. Now, that may seem small. In fact, in the over 60s, it's about 3%, which is really quite large. But this compares, for instance, to SARS, which killed 10%, and Ebola, which killed 80 to 90%. Okay, so it is efficient in the sense that it kills relatively small number of people, but you multiply that by millions or billions, and you will have a huge number. Okay, and of course, we're talking about death. We're not talking about debilitation. We're not talking about disease. We're not talking about the other factors of that. So, what are the effects of this? I think it's too early to say, but already we can actually look at some of the effects, like changes in work habits, perhaps even changes in the way we're producing. You know, this chain production where a product would be produced in 5 or 6 different countries. That may well change now that this pandemic has actually interrupted that. The biggest interruption with this particular pandemic was an interruption in the supply chain across the world. Half the world economy actually stopped for a brief period. You know more about this than I do. And I think it has accentuated, and I mean, this is now a personal view, it's accentuated the US, the weakening of US hegemony in the world. And I'll give you one example of that. All previous pandemics that have occurred, like the Ebola even occurred 5 years ago, okay, the epidemic Ebola pandemic, or the ones that occurred before that, all the previous ones, when the CDC, Center of Disease Control of the US, actually it would take over the control of the entire world, of the way that they dealt with it. The entire world would follow the direction of CDC. In this particular pandemic, where is the CDC? And it's really interesting to me. It's telling me something about the inability of the US even to deal with its own problem inside, let alone guide the rest of the world in terms of how to deal with it. They dealt with it very effectively with Ebola. They dealt with it very effectively in SARS. This time, they're non-existent and continue to be non-existent. We have not had a global response to a global problem. And we are on year 3 and we still don't have a global response. A new virus comes in, new variant comes in this week, and you see each different country behaving, going in its own independent way. There is no global response. That's interesting, and I think that is telling us something about the structure of the capitalist world as we see it developing. I'm just going to finish by just to say to you that I've not said anything about the relationship between viruses, bacteria, their development, and global warming. Okay, and that is a huge field in itself. And these two are obviously quite interrelated with each other. One cause, the eccentricity, the other. And that, so effectively we are talking about nature. So let me just sum up. What I try to argue is the pandemics are man-made, and they are the child of social, economic, and political relations. Okay. If I was to update Rosa Luxemburg's statement, what she made, that in front of us is either barbarism or socialism. I'd like to define barbarism. I think we can now define that barbarism slightly better. I think we can define barbarism in this way, I think. This is my personal view. That while nature is treated as a commodity, while assault on the nature continues, unless we completely change radically and fundamentally the way we live collectively with each other, then perhaps the barbarism that is in front of us, if it wasn't going to be socialism, is a chain of global pandemics, which will terminate in the victory of nature, of part of nature really, over the other part of nature, including humanity. So I think out of this upheaval of pandemics will be the barbarism that Rosa Luxemburg quite rightly predicted, if we don't change the way we live. I think I'll stop there and take any questions for anybody wants.